Hello everyone, and today I would like to talk about best practices for using testRigor and how to find the documentation and so on, and how to find those best practices. Okay, let me start by sharing my screen. And basically, this is Air Test Suite. On the top right, there's the resources section where you have a lot of resources, and you can go to documentation. This is documentation. Hopefully, everybody is familiar with that. And on the top of that documentation, where is the third link? It says testRigor best practices. This is how you find the article, and of course we will share it later on as well. Or you can just Google testRigor best practices. I'm sure you'll be able to find it. And this is not generic test practices. For generic one, you can go there. testRigor on its own actually already implement vast majority of generic best practices, so you don't have to worry about that, which is a great value that testRigor provide to our customers. However, there are several probably most interesting best practices that are specific to testRigor or generic testRigor or like any other system wouldn't be able to address it because we are not on a tool level. This is what we try to figure it out based on feedback of our customers, and we saw our customers are using our application. Based on our frequent conversation, we came up with this list of best practices, and let me walk you through those and just give you a quick good overview and idea what's the best way to use testRigor and what's the right way to write test cases on testRigor. All right, so well, first of all, number one, of course, is test cases should be repeatable. This is very, very basic. I know the majority of users are doing that anyway. But because of its importance, I just wanted to make sure that this is helpful for people who never did create automation before. This is how automated test cases is different from, let's say, test cases in test case management system for manual execution. So it has to be repeatable, and a good example of that would be login flow, or in some cases just creating things like new lead. In case of Salesforce, for example, certain information has to be unique every single time you run the test. For example, if you're signing up, you usually cannot reuse exactly the same email. You need to come up with a different email every single time you sign up. And testRigor gives you all the tools and features in order to be able to successfully achieve that. In particular, probably most important one would be to generate unique data. For example, this is a way how you might want to create a new lead on Salesforce. As you can see here, like we're generating unique name for the first name, for last name, for the company, and generating unique email for the email. This way we know that this is completely unique new lead. There is no overlap with anything whatsoever. Of course, if you intentionally want something to be the same, you can do that. And of course, we can save it. You can save it as a variable and refer to that data later on. For example, you can validate that the record has been created, and you can refer to this data later in the test if you need to pull it up or validate that it assigned, get assigned to something or not. All right. So once again, this is what distinguishes automated test cases from manual one. This is probably the most noticeable difference. That's why we put it there. Next is the generic best practices, not specific to testRigor as well. It is advisable that all test cases end up with validation, and the reason is because when you do last click or last some action, you do not know that that last action actually succeeded. So by adding a validation at the end, you help yourself in validating whether the last action actually gets successful, and therefore making your test case more complete. Next, test cases should be easy to read and understand, and this is where testRigor helps you a lot already. So as you know, in testRigor you write in a version of plain English. However, you can take it to the next step and actually take advantage of reusable rules. What is reusable rule? For those who don't know, reusable rule is just a set of steps that you give a name. So this is the most simple explanation, and you can basically I'll show you an example. What you can do here, if you can click edit test case, you can get these steps in here, copy them. You can go to reusable rules. It's a special tab on the left, paste. Let's call it generate unique data. And then save and find in a place. I found one test where those steps were used. Say yes, replace. Now, when you're looking into that test case, you see that instead of all of those mundane and a lot of details steps, there is just one description saying generate unique data. And this is exactly what I'm talking about here when I talk about readability. It's not just that you can rely on testRigor on making everything readable. You're making it even easier for people to read and understand by basically getting on a higher level where you describe everything from business perspective and having all of those details, what exactly you need to do in a rule. So this way you make your tests much more readable and therefore easier to understand. If you share with someone, people will be able to get it better and easier. It's easy, it would be even for you to deal with it later on when you'll forget what did you do in this test case, and so on and so forth. It's definitely a huge best practice. The next is tests must be written from end user's perspective. So in some cases, then people use our home plugin to record steps. For the test case, the plugin might not do a good job because I was just doing a best guess and trying to work with what it has. And it might you rely on like CSS classes or something like that in order to give you an example for click and stuff. This is definitely not what you should do. If you see something like this happening, you want to go ahead and change it to rely on text that is visible to end user. This way, you will be able to make everything readable and stable, because as soon as those minor detail of implementation will change, it should not affect that particular test. For example, if a field address happen to duplicate itself in both from section and a to section, you can say, hey, I want to enter address into want to enter some data into address in this section from, and not section 2 or section 2 if you want that. So point being is testRigor gives you all the tools in order to be able to purely do this from a user's perspective. And you can explain everything without relying on any invisible details. However, sometimes it might be helpful, instead of saying, hey, click on the second button on the right of this or below that, to address that particular button, instead of saying second, with a more meaningful way. For example, if you have a button which clears filter, it doesn't have anything other than CSS classes to indicate that in the picture, and like our machine learning wasn't able to classify that for you, then instead of using whole mumbo jumbo with all CSS classes which are there on on that particular element, you can resort to partial match and just select part of that those CSS classes, such that that part will be number one, the most descriptive, and number two, most probably will stay the same going forward, even though other parts will change. So like, for example, if you have this very long CSS class, you actually don't need to do all of that. You can just say click clear filter. No, not only it is shorter, but it makes it easier to understand, easier to read, and more stable going forward. It's definitely a good practice. However, as much as you can, you should rely on only information available and visible from a user's perspective to make it end user level specification as much as possible. Next is standard best practice for any coding whatsoever. And at the end of the day, when you writing your test cases in testRigor, it is in sense code, because the instructions, even where they are in English, are executable. And therefore, like some of the best practices from regular coding also apply. And in particular here, like it is advisable and highly advisable to actually have as little or no duplicated code as possible, meaning that if you see yourself doing certain sequence of steps in exactly same steps in several test cases, then it's an indicator that you might want to consider extracting them into a rule, and giving a rule some meaningful name, such that you use that rule instead of that sequences of steps over and over again. And the reason for that best practice is that because if any of those steps would change, later down the road when application changes and so on and so forth, there will be only one place for you to fix it. So it makes it more maintainable, easier to maintain, and of course, easier to understand as soon as you assign meaningful name to it. Next is tests should be independent from each other so that they can run in parallel. That's another thing we see, and that is kind of a little bit of a tough one because you need to think certain way in order to be able to do it properly, and it's a little bit of an art. Let me get into this. So by default, all the test cases in testRigor will execute in parallel for you, and it is done for performance reasons. So imagine if, for example, you have 1,000 test cases and they execute within 20 hours. If you execute those tests, well, on one prioritization, if you execute on a 10 prioritization, the time to execute most probably will drop to around 2 hours. So it's just a matter of speed of execution, which is very, very important because you want to make sure that it is usable by engineers, and they want usually every single change to be validated. So therefore, there are some kind of performance constraints, how quickly your test should run. And at some point, there is no other way other than running those tests in parallel. So being able to run tests in parallel is exceptionally important. And however, why am I saying it's art? Is because in theory, the best way to achieve execution of this test in parallel is to create all the data you need in the test within the test itself. But however, it might not be necessarily a practical way to do it, because that creation of test data might take like 10 times longer than the test itself, and might be some kind of overkill if you need to just reuse the same, let's say, company name over and over again in your tests. So you don't need to create that company like every single time. You, for example, just need to test adding additional employee to that company or something like that. So you need to therefore apply common sense and be very, very cautious into finding the balance. Like what would you do to make your test independent, to be able to run in parallel, and to be able to run in any random order whatsoever. So because this is what happens if you do not control the order, and that again is a feature, because today you might have 10 prioritizations, tomorrow you'll get 20, and therefore things will start running in a little bit different order, even if test cases themselves do not change. So, therefore you want to create your test data to a certain degree as much as possible. Now, it might not necessarily even be an art, because there is a clear indicator. Well, by default, you want to create the data that you need, so that should be the default. However, the indicator that you can reuse existing data is that you neither this test, your current test, nor other test change that particular object which you rely on to a degree that will affect that test. For example, if you need to add employee to a company, as soon as you do not change the name of the company, delete the company, or anything like that, or no other tests do that to that company, they should be safe for you to reuse that company object and therefore save time on creating unique data for repairable tests. So those are some tips on how to make it work. Next is test data, and specifically test credentials are stored in test data. Well, if you know that certain things might be changing in the future, it might be a good idea to extract out those test data, and especially credentials such as username and password. Because for security reasons, I'm sure your security team will come to you and ask to change those credentials from time to time, and you don't want to go ahead and fix it all over the place in all of your tests. This is one. And second, testRigor also hides your passwords so that it's a little bit more secure when you work together with other people who shouldn't know unnecessarily those passwords. So for the main place to store the password will be an authentication section, most probably an app-specific authentication, login and password. If you see type of password, it is hidden. However, you can have as many passwords as you'd like in test data. You can click add and select hidden as a type. Like of data, and say password 2, and whatever you type here would be hidden, and therefore you'll be able to reuse it. Press the board and it will be hidden. Go forward. Next is one testRigor test case for one test. That's another best practice that is related to performance and convenience of test execution. So ideally, as much as possible, you want to have one testRigor test case for one unique test. You don't want to bulk them up. So usually when we see people do bulk them up is because we have a dependency. But as I mentioned, that dependency might mean that you actually need to have multiple tests. So if you break down your large tests into smaller ones, it will allow you to take advantage of prioritization and actually execute your tests much faster, which you might not otherwise be able to do. So it is important to do it as much as it is, of course, possible. And finally, tests should use built-in testRigor functionality for better stability and performance. And in particular, I want to point out that we have functionality to work with emails, and particularly check the emails that will render email, so you can get the data from email. In there, you can allocate emails for literally every single time you use it, and so on and so forth, as well as there are some built-in rules like login. In testRigor, you definitely want to take advantage of that as much as possible. The advantage of using rules, built-in rules like login, is that if your login will change, for example, from one-step login to multi-step login, where you provide first email and then password on the next step. If you use the built-in rules for login for testRigor, you won't have to change anything. It will just continue to work for you. All of your test cases will not break. If you're trying to code everything yourself, then this is where it might break. You might need to change something in order to fix your login procedure. So please do take advantage of what testRigor offers out of the box as much as possible. to make your life easier as much as you can. This is what we are trying to do here, to help here in testRigor. Okay, so we are closing on time in here. So on that, I would like to thank you very much for watching this best practices video, and I'll pass it back to Connie on that.
Is there a case when a test can be too long, that you should split it into separate parts? That's a question.
Yes, it needs to be atomic, basically in the sense of a logical test. So one test in testRigor ideally should represent one logical test from end user's perspective. So if it contains more than one logical end-to-end test, but this is where it needs to be broken down. But we do see in some cases, like in education and so on and so forth, some of the tests sometimes might be very, very long. Or in government, like we have exceptionally long test cases in some cases, because the process is so long and there is so many information that needs to be dealt around with. But there is some more like an exception, and majority of the cases, test cases usually are manageable. And like they should be kept as short as possible to a degree that they represent logical end-to-end tests.
All right, well, that's all the questions, and we are at time. So thank you, Artem, for those best practices. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.